In 4 days in June 1944, one American submarine commander did something the United States Navy had spent 20 years telling its officers never to do. He won. Then, 8 weeks later, the same tactic killed him and 79 of his men. His name was Samuel Dealey. For 80 years, the Pacific Ocean kept his bones. In 2024, the ocean finally gave them back. This is the story of the morning he changed how submarines fight forever, and the morning, just weeks later, when it cost him everything. The periscope broke the surface at 6:47 in the morning. Commander Samuel David Dealey kept his hands steady on the handles. Outside, the Sulu Sea was a flat sheet of mercury, the sun still low behind the islands of the southern Philippines. Inside the USS Harder, 79 men breathed the recycled air. Sweat was already soaking through their dungarees. Dealey turned the periscope a slow 90 degrees, and then he saw them, 3 Japanese destroyers, bows raised in white foam, charging straight at his position. The numbers came automatically. Range 1,200 yards, bearing 345, speed 30 knots and closing. In every American submarine school, in every tactical manual ever printed by the United States Navy, the next order was already written. Dive deep. Run silent. Pray the destroyers passed overhead without finding you. That was the doctrine. That was the book. Dealey did not give that order. He stood very still, looking through the lens, calculating something that no submarine commander in the Pacific had ever attempted under live conditions. His executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Frank Lynch, watched him from the chart table. Lynch was a careful officer, trained by the manual, and he had been preparing his entire career to obey the manual. Lynch waited for the dive alarm. The dive alarm did not come. Instead, Dealey said 3 words, very quietly, that would change the way the United States Navy fought submarines for the rest of the war. Battle stations. Forward. To understand how a 37-year-old commander from Dallas, Texas, came to make that decision on that morning, we have to go back. We have to go back nearly a year, to a closed-door conference in Pearl Harbor, where the Pacific Submarine Force was quietly admitting that it was losing the war. The map on the wall of Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood's briefing room was covered in red crosses. Each cross was a submarine. Each cross was 80 men who would never come home. 52 crosses. Lockwood was 54 years old, a career submariner, and he was tired in a way that did not show on his face. He stood before his commanders and laid out the numbers without ornament. The Mark 14 torpedo, the weapon his men carried into every fight, was failing on more than half of all attempts. It ran too deep. The magnetic exploder detonated early. The contact pin crumpled on impact. American submariners were firing precision weapons that did everything except explode. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington had spent 20 months denying there was a problem at all. Lockwood did not say any of this aloud. He did not have to. Every officer in that room had buried a friend. In the back of the room sat a quiet commander who had never drawn attention. Samuel Dealey had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1930, somewhere in the middle of his class. He had spent 12 years on battleships and destroyers before transferring to submarines. He was not a prodigy. He had no reputation. His wife, Edwina, lived with their 3 daughters in a small house in Perth, Western Australia, because that was where he could see them between patrols. When Lockwood opened the floor for questions, Dealey raised his hand. His proposal was simple, and it was heresy. The destroyers, he said, were not obstacles, they were targets. Every destroyer the submarine force sank was one less escort hunting the next American boat. If they could develop a reliable method of killing destroyers, the entire calculus of the war would shift. The room went very quiet. The standard tactic against a charging destroyer was called the down-the-throat shot. It had a documented success rate of less than 10%. The destroyer's bow was a target only 30 feet wide. The torpedo spread could not guarantee a hit, and if you missed, you had no time to dive, you died. Lockwood listened. Then he said no. Not yet. The risk was too high, the boats too few. The conservative doctrine, the doctrine that had cost 52 submarines, would remain the doctrine. Dealey nodded. He sat down. He did not argue, but he did not let it go either. This is the first thing you need to understand about the man at the periscope on the morning of June 6, 1944. He was not reckless. He was not a cowboy. He was a careful, methodical officer who had concluded, through observation and arithmetic, that the safe path was the path that got men killed. The second thing you need to understand is what was wrong with the boat. The USS Harder was not broken in the way you might imagine. Her engines worked. Her hull was sound. By the standards of a 1944 fleet submarine, she was in fighting trim. What was broken were the torpedoes in her tubes and the doctrine that told her crew how to use them. 20 months of denial in the Bureau of Ordnance, 20 years of conservative tactics at the submarine school in Groton, Connecticut, that was the brokenness aboard the USS Harder. And on the morning of June 6, 1944, Commander Samuel Dealey was about to test a different theory. May 26, 1944, Fremantle, Western Australia. The USS Harder slipped out of port at first light, riding low in the water with a full load of fuel and 24 Mark 14 torpedoes. On the dock, a small group of officers watched her go. Among them stood Rear Admiral Ralph Christie, the commander of submarines in the Southwest Pacific. Christie was a complicated man, 50 years old, fiercely loyal to his aggressive commanders, and he had personally pinned 3 Navy crosses onto Samuel Dealey's chest over the previous 12 months. Christie did not give Dealey a hunting mission. Patrol 5 was something else entirely. The orders were partly clandestine. The Harder was to proceed north into the waters off northeastern Borneo and retrieve 6 Allied operatives, Australian coast watchers and intelligence men who had been gathering information on Japanese movements from the jungle and who were now exposed and being hunted. The rescue had to happen at night, from a small beach, without lights. After the rescue, the Harder was to continue north into the Sulu Sea and conduct reconnaissance on a remote anchorage in the southernmost Philippines called Tawi-Tawi. Nobody on the American side knew exactly what was at Tawi-Tawi. Intelligence suggested the Japanese might be using the anchorage as a staging area. The terrain was favorable, the water was deep. It was within range of the Borneo oil fields, which mattered enormously to a Japanese fleet that had been hemorrhaging fuel since the loss of the East Indies tanker routes. There were rumors of warships moving in and out, but the anchorage was sheltered, screened by islands, and almost impossible to observe from the air, so they sent a submarine to look. That was the mission. Rescue, then reconnaissance, not combat. Dealey was not going to Tawi-Tawi to hunt, he was going to Tawi-Tawi to count. The rescue happened on the night of May 30th. The coast watchers came out of the jungle in a rubber boat, 6 exhausted men with rifles and notebooks. The Harder took them aboard in the dark. Dealey did not ask for their reports. He gave them coffee. He turned the boat south, then east, then north again, threading through the Sulu archipelago with the careful patience of a man who knew the cost of mistakes. By June 5th, they were in the approaches to Tawi-Tawi. By June 6th, just before dawn, Dealey ordered the periscope raised. This is the part that nobody on the Allied side anticipated. The intelligence assessments had described Tawi-Tawi as a possible Japanese staging area, a few destroyers perhaps, a tanker or two, a modest forward base. What Dealey saw through the periscope was something else. Battleships, the unmistakable silhouettes of Yamato and Musashi, the 2 largest warships ever constructed, anchored side by side in the channel. Aircraft carriers, 6 of them visible through the periscope at the heart of Japan's remaining naval aviation. Heavy cruisers and light cruisers, 13 of them, in formations that suggested an active fleet, not a reserve. And destroyers, many destroyers. More than 30, the entire Japanese mobile fleet was sitting in front of him. Lynch read the count over his shoulder and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The Harder had stumbled, by sheer geographic accident, onto the largest concentration of Japanese naval power assembled since the Battle of Midway. The fleet was here for a reason. Operation Ago, the Japanese plan to draw the American carriers into a decisive battle, was being staged from this anchorage. The American invasion of Saipan was 9 days away. If Dealey could get this information back to Pearl Harbor, the entire shape of the coming battle could change. If he could not, if his radio failed, if the Harder did not survive the next hour, the Pacific Fleet would steam into the Philippine Sea blind, looking for an enemy whose composition and position they did not know. Dealey lowered the periscope. He stood for a long moment with his eyes closed. Then the sonar man called out a contact. 3 destroyers, bearing 005, closing fast. The Japanese had not seen the harder, but the Japanese always patrolled the approaches at dawn. It was a matter of routine. 3 destroyers, sweeping outward from the anchorage in standard formation, were now on a course that would pass directly over the position where the USS Harder was loitering. Periscope just below the surface, 79 men breathing carefully in the recycled air. In the next 4 minutes, Samuel Dealey had a choice to make. Option 1, dive deep, wait for the destroyers to pass, slip away in the night and bring the intelligence home. This was the safe option. This was the correct option by every standard of submarine doctrine taught in 1944. Option 2, attack, sink one of those destroyers. Make the Japanese fleet aware that an American submarine had penetrated their secret anchorage, force them to react, force them to move. He did not know yet that the second option, the option that violated every page of his training manual, would alter the course of the Pacific War. He only knew that he had 6 torpedoes in his forward tubes, that the lead destroyer was now 1,200 yards out and closing at 30 knots. That his entire crew was watching him in the dim red light of the control room, waiting for the dive order they had been trained to expect. He raised the periscope again. He looked through the lens one more time, and then he gave the order that the United States Navy had spent 2 years telling its commanders never to give: battle stations. Forward. The torpedo room was the loneliest place on the boat. Forward of the control room, 3 decks down, the chief torpedoman watched his men work. The Mark 14 torpedoes weighed 3,000 pounds each. They sat in their tubes like sleeping animals. The men running their final checks knew, all of them knew, that 50 out of every 100 of these weapons had been failing in combat for 2 years. But here, in the warm half-darkness of the Sulu Sea on the morning of June 6, 1944, the men of the USS Harder did not have the luxury of doubt. Above them, on the surface, the lead destroyer was 800 yards out and closing. In the control room, Samuel Dealey held the periscope handles in a grip that had gone past tension and into something else. He was reading the geometry of the attack the way a chess player reads a board. The destroyer was not turning. The bow was pointed straight at his periscope. The angle was 0. The bow target was 30 feet wide, and here is the part that the histories sometimes forget. Dealey was not attacking because he was brave. He was attacking because he had run out of options. The destroyers had spotted his periscope when he raised it to count the fleet. By the time he understood that they had seen him, it was already too late to dive. The lead destroyer was inside the safe diving distance. If he tried to take the Harder down now, the destroyer would be over him before he reached 200 feet, and the depth charges would crack his hull like an egg. He could fight or he could die. That was the choice. That was the truth of the down-the-throat shot on the morning of June 6, 1944. Years later, when training manuals taught this tactic as a model of offensive submarine warfare, the lesson was always presented as a triumph of vision and nerve. The truth was simpler and harder. Dealey did not invent a new way of fighting in that moment. He found himself trapped, and he reached for the only weapon left in his hand. Range, he said. 700 yards, Captain. He lowered the periscope a fraction, bearing 345, dead ahead. Through the lens he could see the bow wave of the destroyer breaking white over her plates. He could see the small figures of Japanese sailors on her deck. He could see, just behind the bridge, the long racks of depth charges already being prepared for the kill. He counted to himself. 6, 5, 4, 3, fire 1. The boat shuddered as the compressed air punched the first torpedo into the sea. Fire 2. A second shudder. Fire 3. He did not wait to watch. Take her down. 400 feet, all ahead full. The Harder's bow dropped sharply, and the men in the control room reached for handholds as the deck tilted under them. The depth gauge began to spin. 100 feet, 150, 200. The lights swayed on their fittings. Somewhere in the forward compartment, a coffee cup slid off a shelf and shattered on the deck. Above them, the Mark 14 torpedoes were running at 46 knots in a tight spread, 3 white wakes converging on a 30-foot target at a distance of 600 yards. The arithmetic gave them less than 17 seconds of life. In the control room, no one spoke. Lynch counted the seconds on his wristwatch. At 17 seconds, the sea above them lit up. The first explosion came as a high crack, sharp and clean, transmitted through the water with the unmistakable signature of a Torpex warhead detonating against a steel hull. The second explosion came half a second later. The third torpedo missed. It did not matter. The first two had struck the Japanese destroyer Minazuki, and Minazuki was already coming apart. She was an older ship, a Mutsuki-class destroyer commissioned in 1927. About 150 men served aboard her. The first torpedo killed many of them outright. The second flooded her boiler rooms. She rolled to port, dipped her bow, and slid under the surface of the Sulu Sea in less than 90 seconds. Of the roughly 150 men of her crew, nearly all went down with the ship. Inside the harder, the men heard the breakup, the hiss of escaping air. The deep, slow groan of bulkheads collapsing under sea pressure. The submariners called it the breaking up noise. It was the sound of a warship dying. Every man on the harder had been trained to recognize it, and every man on the harder knew in that moment that the same sound could come for them at any time. Dealey closed his eyes for a second. He did not allow himself any longer. The two remaining destroyers in the screen were already wheeling. Their sonar pinged through the hull, a high metallic chirp that sounded like a hammer striking a bell. The first depth charges hit the water above the harder 30 seconds later. For the next 4 hours, the men of the USS Harder held on. The depth charges came in patterns of 6 and 8. They detonated above the boat, beside the boat, sometimes seemingly inside the boat. Light bulbs shattered. Cork insulation rained down from the overhead. The hull plates groaned and flexed. In the maneuvering room, the electrician's mate watched the battery readings climb dangerously toward the threshold, where hydrogen gas would begin to escape into the boat. One spark, and they would burn. Dealey took the harder deeper. He changed course in slow, careful zigzags. He used the thermal layers in the sea to break the Japanese sonar. He did not speak above a whisper. None of his men did. They breathed in the recycled air, and they listened to the rhythm of the screws above them, and they waited. By midday, the destroyers gave up. The harder surfaced cautiously into an empty sea. The first thing Dealey did was send a radio message to Pearl Harbor. The second thing he did was light a cigarette. The message he sent was a model of compression. He reported the location of the Japanese mobile fleet at Tawi-Tawi. He listed the warships he had identified. He confirmed the destruction of one Japanese destroyer using a head-on torpedo attack at close range. He requested permission to continue patrolling the approaches to the anchorage. The message traveled by encrypted radio through relay stations across the Pacific. It reached Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood in his office at Pearl Harbor that afternoon. Lockwood read it twice. Then he reached out to Rear Admiral Ralph Christie in Fremantle. Here is something the dramatized versions of this story sometimes get wrong. Lockwood and Christie did not argue about Samuel Dealey. They did not divide into factions of conservative and aggressive submarine doctrine. They did not threaten each other or talk about court-martials. What they did was simpler. They agreed. Christie had pinned 3 Navy crosses on Dealey's chest already. He knew exactly what kind of officer he was dealing with. Lockwood, despite his caution at the conference the year before, had been waiting for evidence that the down-the-throat shot could work. He now had that evidence. The two admirals agreed within the span of a single phone call that the harder would be permitted, even encouraged, to continue her patrol with weapons free. The reply that came back to the harder that afternoon was 4 words: "Good hunting. Continue mission." Dealey read the message standing on the bridge of his surfaced submarine, the wind off the Sulu Sea pulling at his collar. He folded the paper. He put it in his pocket. He looked out across the empty water in the direction of Tawi-Tawi. The next destroyer he found was named Hayanami. It was the morning of June 7th, less than 24 hours after the death of Minazuki. The harder had moved to a new position at the western entrance to the Sibutu Passage, the narrow channel that connected the Sulu Sea to the Celeb Sea south of the Philippines. The passage was the natural route for any ship entering or leaving the Tawi-Tawi anchorage. If the Japanese were sending out picket patrols, they would come through Sibutu. Hayanami came through Sibutu at first light. She was a newer destroyer than Minazuki, a Yugumo-class ship, fast and well-armed. 228 men served aboard her. She was searching specifically for the American submarine that had killed Minazuki the day before. She was alert. She was hunting. Dealey saw her at 12,000 yards through the periscope. This time the geometry was different. This time he had time to set up. He had time to think, and this time he did something that he had not done the day before. He committed, in the cold quiet of the control room, to attack a Japanese destroyer head-on by choice. Not because he was trapped, not because he had no other option, but because the tactic that had saved his life the previous morning was, perhaps, the tactic that could save other American lives in the months to come. He let Hayanami close to 1,500 yards. He let her close to 1,200. He let her close to 900. Then he fired 4 torpedoes in a tight spread. 2 of them hit. Hayanami's bow lifted out of the water, then her stern, and she broke in half just forward of the bridge. The forward section sank in less than 2 minutes. The aft section drifted, burning, for another 20. Of the 228 men aboard, only 45 were rescued. Dealey took the harder deep and slipped away. He had now killed 2 Japanese destroyers in 2 days. This was something no American submarine commander had ever accomplished before. June 9, 1944, Sibutu Passage. Tanikaze was a Kagero-class destroyer, one of the most effective anti-submarine ships in the Japanese fleet. 240 men served aboard her. She was part of a tanker escort protecting a fuel carrier on its way to deliver oil to the mobile fleet at WWII. The harder found her at 1,100 yards. Dealey fired 3 torpedoes. 2 of them hit Tanikaze just aft of her bridge. The magazine detonated almost instantly. The destroyer disintegrated in a single white flash that the men of the harder felt through the hull as a sharp, dry concussion. There was no breaking up noise this time. There was nothing left to break up. The ship simply ceased to exist. Of her 240 men, 12 survived, blown clear of the wreckage and recovered hours later. 3 destroyers in 4 days. In the Imperial Japanese Navy, this had no precedent. No American submarine had ever killed 3 destroyers in any patrol, let alone in 96 hours. In Tokyo, the news worked its way up the chain of command. It reached the office of Admiral Chiyoda Soemu, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, on the morning of June 10th. Chiyoda was 59 years old, a careful officer with a reputation for caution. He had taken command of the fleet only 6 weeks earlier, after his predecessor had been killed in a plane crash. The news from WWII did not make his morning easier. At the same time, on the battleship Yamato anchored in the channel at WWII, Vice Admiral Ugaki Matomi was writing in the diary he kept every night. Ugaki was 54 years old, the commander of Battleship Division 1, and a survivor of the plane crash that had killed Admiral Yamamoto a year earlier. His diary entries from this period record the loss of 3 destroyers in 4 days with a tone of unmistakable alarm. The American submarine threat, he noted, had exceeded all projections. The pattern of attacks was unusual. The submarine appeared to be hunting destroyers specifically, a departure from standard American tactics. If the Americans had developed a reliable method of killing escort ships, the entire Japanese system of convoy protection was in question. It is one of the strange truths of war that a single man, working in the cramped control room of a fleet submarine, can cause an entire admiralty to lose sleep. On the night of June 9th, Samuel Dealey was that man. He had no way of knowing that he had become, in the minds of the Japanese High Command, an existential problem. He only knew that he had not slept in 72 hours. The next morning, June 10th, the Imperial Japanese Navy came hunting in force. The harder was running on the surface just before dawn, charging her batteries in the morning quiet when the lookout in the conning tower saw the smoke on the horizon. Not 3 ships this time, not 4, 6. 6 destroyers, line abreast, sweeping outward from the entrance to WWII in a coordinated search pattern, sonar pinging through the water in overlapping arcs. They were not patrolling, they were hunting. Dealey took the harder down. What followed was the worst day of his career. For 6 hours, the Japanese destroyers worked over the section of sea where the harder had submerged. They dropped 149 depth charges. They worked in shifts. When one destroyer ran out of charges, another took its place. They used active sonar continuously, locking onto the harder, losing her, finding her again as she changed course and depth. Inside the boat, the temperature climbed past 110 degrees. The men stripped to their shorts. The oxygen content dropped to 43% of normal. Men began to gasp. The medical officer moved from compartment to compartment, watching for the signs of carbon dioxide poisoning, watching for the men whose lips were turning blue, watching for the men who would simply slump to the deck without a word. In the maneuvering room, the hydrogen reading on the battery monitor began to creep up. Hydrogen gas, released by submerged batteries running too hard for too long, was odorless and colorless and lethal. At a concentration of 4% in the boat's air, a single electrical spark would ignite it. There would be no warning. There would be no second chance. The engineer reported the reading to Dealey in a flat voice. Dealey nodded. He did not change course. He could not change course. The destroyers above were waiting for him to surface. If he came up, they would kill him in the open. If he stayed down, the hydrogen would kill him below. He chose to stay down for 4 more hours. 40 miles north of the Harder's position, in the morning of June 10th, Vice Admiral Jisuburo Ozawa, the commander of the Mobile Fleet, was meeting with his senior staff aboard the carrier Taiho. The meeting was about the American advance on Biak, an island northwest of New Guinea, where US forces had landed 2 weeks earlier. The Japanese were preparing a counteroffensive to retake the island. The plan was complicated. It would require detaching part of the Mobile Fleet to support the operation. But there was another problem on the agenda that morning. A problem that had not been there when the fleet first arrived at WWII 6 weeks earlier. The American submarine, the one that was killing their destroyers. The one that was apparently still out there, still operating, still hunting. Tawi was supposed to be safe. That was the entire purpose of the anchorage. The Japanese had chosen it because it was screened by islands, because it was close to the Borneo oil fields, because the Americans, they had assumed, could not find it or reach it. Now an American submarine was sitting in the approaches, killing their destroyers one at a time, and the Imperial Japanese Navy could not seem to kill her in return. Ozawa made his decision before noon. The Mobile Fleet would leave Tawi. The orders went up to Toyoda in Tokyo. Toyoda confirmed them by the end of the day. The fleet would sortie, head north and east, and begin moving toward the central Philippines, where the planned response to the coming American invasion of the Marianas would be staged. The decision was driven by many factors. The American invasion of Saipan was clearly imminent. The Biak situation was deteriorating. The Mobile Fleet needed to be at sea, not anchored. These were the formal reasons recorded in the staff papers. But the informal reason, the unwritten reason, the reason that every officer in the Japanese fleet understood without needing to say it aloud, was simpler. They could not stay where Samuel Dealey could find them. The first sign of all this inside the harder was an absence. At 20 minutes past 1 in the afternoon of June 10th, the depth charges stopped. The men in the control room held still, listening, waiting for the next pattern. The next pattern did not come. The chief sonar operator pressed his headphones tighter against his ears. He listened to the screws of the Japanese destroyers fading into the distance, all 6 of them moving northeast at high speed, away from the harder, away from the position where they had been killing the American submarine for 6 hours. He looked at Dealey. Dealey looked back. "They're leaving, Captain." "All of them?" "All of them." Dealey did not believe it for a long minute. He kept the harder at 400 feet for another hour, waiting for the trick, waiting for the silent run that he was sure was a ruse to catch him when he surfaced. But the destroyers did not come back. When the harder finally rose to periscope depth, the sea around her was empty. Dealey did not know yet that he had won. He did not know that, 40 miles to the north, the entire Japanese Mobile Fleet was at that moment preparing to leave Tawi. He did not know that in 3 days, on June 13th, the Yamato and the Musashi, the 2 largest battleships in the world, would steam out of the channel that he had been watching for 4 days. He did not know that the carriers, the cruisers, the surviving destroyers, all of them, were about to put to sea on a course that would take them 9 days later into the killing zone of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. What Dealey knew at that moment on the afternoon of June 10th, 1944, was only that he was alive, that his crew was alive, that the hydrogen in the battery compartment had not ignited. That somehow, against the calculated odds of every tactical manual ever written, 3 Mark 14 torpedoes and 1 American submarine and 79 men breathing the bad air of a fleet boat had forced the most powerful naval force in the Pacific to abandon its hiding place. He raised the periscope one more time. The horizon was empty in every direction. He lowered the periscope. He turned to Lynch, who had not slept in 72 hours either, and who was looking at him now with the careful, exhausted expression of a man who had survived something he was not supposed to survive. Dealey said one word, "Coffee." Lynch did not answer. He could not. He nodded once, and turned away and walked aft toward the galley, his hand brushing the bulkhead for balance as he went. The harder surfaced at sunset. The fresh air poured down through the hatch like something holy, and 400 miles to the north the Japanese mobile fleet was already at sea, headed for a battle it did not yet know it had already lost. They came into Darwin on the morning of June 21st. The harbour was quiet. The sun was up. The pilot boat met them outside the channel and led them through the netted opening of the anti-submarine boom, past the rusted hulls of ships that had been bombed by the Japanese 2 years earlier and never quite removed. On the dock, a small group of officers was waiting. The man at the front was Rear Admiral Ralph Christie. Christie did not say much. He shook Dealey's hand. He looked at the 4 small Japanese battle flags lashed to the periscope shears, one for each destroyer the harder had attacked, 3 sunk and 1 damaged. He looked at the cracked plates on the forward hull where the depth charges had warped the steel. He looked at the men of the harder coming down the gangway in single file, unshaven, hollow-eyed, walking with the careful slowness of men who had not stood on solid ground in nearly a month. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. The Navy Cross, Dealey's 4th. Fewer than 10 Navy officers in the entire Second World War would ever receive 4 of them. Christie pinned this one on Dealey's khaki shirt right there on the dock in the morning sun without ceremony or speech, the way a father pins something on a son. Then he stepped back. He said, "Get some sleep, Sam." That was all. While the harder was tying up in Darwin, 400 miles to the north and east, the Battle of the Philippine Sea was already over. It had begun on the morning of June 19th, and it had ended by the afternoon of June 20th. In 2 days, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 3 aircraft carriers and approximately 600 aircraft. The carrier Taiho, the largest and newest in the Japanese fleet, had been hit by a single torpedo from the submarine USS Albacore and had blown apart from internal vapor explosions 6 hours later. The carrier Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, had been sunk by the submarine USS Kavala. The carrier Hio had gone down under American aircraft on the 2nd day. American pilots, watching the lopsided slaughter in the air, gave it a name that would last: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It is important to be honest about what happened and what did not happen. The harder did not win the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Many things won that battle. American codebreakers had been reading Japanese fleet signals for months. American radar was vastly superior. American pilots were better trained than the green Japanese aviators who had replaced the pre-war veterans lost at Midway and Guadalcanal. American fuel was clean and abundant. Japanese fuel hastily refined from Borneo crude fouled engines and shortened flight ranges, but it is also true that none of those advantages would have mattered if the Japanese mobile fleet had stayed hidden at Tawi-Tawi. The harder did not win the battle. The harder forced the battle to happen. That is a smaller claim and a truer one, and it is the claim that the official Navy histories settled on after the war. By the end of June, the news of the harder's patrol had reached every submarine in the Pacific. Dealey's tactical reports were copied and distributed. The down-the-throat shot, the tactic that the submarine school at Groton, Connecticut, had spent 20 years telling its officers never to attempt, was now being taught as a viable option of last resort. The hit rate against destroyers across the entire American submarine force began to climb. By the end of the war, it would be roughly triple what it had been before. Other commanders began to attempt the tactic. Some of them succeeded. Some of them did not. This is the cost that no one talks about when they tell this story. For every American submarine captain who tried what Dealey had done and lived, there were submarine captains who tried it and died, and crews who died with them, and families in places like Indiana and Oregon and Tennessee who received the telegram that began with the words the Secretary of the Navy regrets. War does not reward courage with survival. It rewards luck and timing and the calculations of men far away. Samuel Dealey understood this. He had buried friends. He knew exactly what he was asking his men to do. When the Harder was offered her standard rest period after the 5th patrol, when Dealey was offered the shore duty that his record had more than earned, he turned it down. He volunteered for the 6th patrol. His wife and 3 daughters were a few hours away by ship in Perth. He did not go to see them. He turned the Harder around in 7 weeks, took on new torpedoes, replaced the men who had transferred off the boat, and put to sea again in August of 1944. This time the patrol area was the western coast of Luzon. This time the Harder would not be operating alone. She was part of a wolf pack, 3 submarines hunting together. The USS Haddo and the USS Hake would patrol with her, coordinating attacks against Japanese coastal traffic. This time the target environment was different. Luzon was not the deep open water of the Sulu Sea. The water close to the coast was only 200 or 300 feet deep in places. There was no real thermal layer to hide under. There was no real way to go deep when things went wrong. This time the Japanese were ready. On the morning of August 24, 1944, the Harder was operating off Cayman Point on the western coast of Luzon when she made contact with a small Japanese convoy. The convoy included escort vessels. One of them was the coastal defense ship CD-22, a Type D Kabokan designed and built specifically for anti-submarine warfare. What happened in the next 2 hours has been pieced together from Japanese after-action reports, from sonar contacts logged by the USS Haddo, and now, finally, from the wreck itself. Dealey attacked first. He attacked the way he had attacked at Tawi-Tawi. Close, fast, direct. He fired torpedoes at the escorts at short range. The water was shallow. He could not dive deep enough to break contact afterward. The CD-22 turned on him. She put down a pattern of depth charges that was very nearly perfect. The first salvo was close. The second was closer. The third was on top of the Harder. There was no breaking up noise this time. There was no slow groan of failing bulkheads. The pressure hull of the USS Harder collapsed in the space of a single breath, and the boat went straight to the bottom, and 79 men were dead before they knew they had been hit. Samuel Dealey was 37 years old. The Harder was officially listed as missing on the 2nd of October 1944. She was officially presumed lost on the 2nd of January 1945. Edwina Dealey received the telegram in the small house in Perth, where she lived with her 3 daughters. The telegram said what those telegrams always say: "The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you." 10 months later, on the 15th of November 1945, President Harry S. Truman presented the Medal of Honor to Edwina Dealey in a quiet ceremony at the White House. She brought the older girls with her. She did not cry during the ceremony. The citation that was read aloud spoke of conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. It spoke of brilliant leadership and superb seamanship. It spoke, in the careful language of official commendations, of a commander who had taken on 5 Japanese destroyers in less than a week. What it did not say, because Medal of Honor citations do not say such things, was that Samuel Dealey had been an ordinary man who had concluded, by quiet arithmetic, that the way the United States Navy had taught him to fight was getting Americans killed. He had tested a different way. He had been right, and the same tactic that he had pioneered, the same close-range attack that had broken the Japanese mobile fleet, had 8 weeks later broken him in turn. That is the part of the story that is not easy to look at directly. The tools that win wars are also the tools that consume the men who wield them. For 80 years, the USS Harder lay on the bottom of the South China Sea in waters that were too deep and too remote to search. Then, in May of 2024, a research vessel operating with the Lost 52 project located her at a depth of approximately 3,000 feet, 20 miles off Cayman Point. The submarine sat upright on the sea floor. Her bow was still pointed forward, into the direction of her last attack. She was nearly intact. No bodies were recovered. None could have been. The men of the harder are still where they fell, sealed in the pressure hull that killed them, in the position where they died doing the work they had been trained to do. International law protects the wreck as a war grave. No one is permitted to disturb it. The men who built this story will not give it back. What Samuel Dealey did, in the end, is what every honest history of submarine warfare in the Pacific has to come to terms with. He was not a legend before the morning of June 6, 1944. He was not a legend on the morning of August 24th either. He was a man. He made hard decisions in confined spaces with insufficient information. He saved lives that we will never count, and he ended lives that he could not have saved. He did not seek any of this. He took the harder out a sixth time, because he was the kind of man who took the harder out a sixth time. There is no more complicated explanation than that, and there is none simpler. The Pacific is wide. It hides what it takes. For 80 years it hid the USS Harder. Now we know where she rests. Now we know what the men aboard her did before they came to rest there. Now we know what it cost them, and we know what it cost the country that sent them. That has to be enough. It is all we are going to get.